Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to part two of the Cold War. This 15-minute slideshow will represent lesson three of chapter 31. So far, lesson one, we learned about the causes of the Cold War and the early events of the Cold War. In lesson two, you should have read about the growth of China, communism in China, and things happening in Asia. Today in lesson three, then, we're going to talk about some examples of how the Cold War got hot. Now, if you remember in lesson one, we mentioned that the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was a series of proxy wars. It's called the Cold War because the United States never went head to head against the Soviet Union. What we did, as I described in lesson one, is we kind of like played chess with each other, using smaller, weaker nations around the world as the pawns on the chessboard. And this is exactly what we're going to talk about in lesson three, beginning with the Korean War. The first time the Cold War will actually get hot is only 5 years after the end of World War II. Remember, World War II ended in 1945. By 1950, we're going to already heat up the Cold War, and it's going to happen right here in the Korean Peninsula. You can see where we are in the world. Here's Japan and China, Asia, and then here is the Korean Peninsula. So basically, the Korean War, if you remember, North Korea had been occupied by the Soviet Union by the Japanese surrender in World War II. So this is where the Soviet troops had to stop, and they never left, and they installed Kim Il Sung, the grandfather of today's dictator of North Korea, as their puppet dictator in charge of communist North Korea. Whereas in the South, the southern part of the peninsula, South Korea, became an independent, democratic, capitalist nation, very powerful industrial nation even today. And basically, the Korean War, which is a 3 year war from 1950 to 1953, takes place because the North Korean dictator, with Chinese and Soviet support, giving them supplies and weapons, launched a surprise invasion into South Korea, catching everyone off guard, trying to conquer South Korea and take control of the entire peninsula. So this is what we describe as the first military action, the first time the Cold War actually got hot. And let me explain in just 1 or 2 minutes how the war took place. So here's North Korea, here's South Korea. The 38th parallel is what most generally divides the two nations. In 1950, the North Koreans did launch a massive surprise attack into South Korea, catching everyone off guard, pushing the South Koreans and the American soldiers who were stationed in South Korea, helping to rebuild them, all the way back to a small area here that's called the Pusan Pocket. Now, here's the capital city. The capital city was overrun very quickly, but enough of the American soldiers and South Korean soldiers were able to create a perimeter, what they call the Pusan Pocket, to finally slow down the invasion forces and hold off. They're getting supplied by sea out of Japan, because Japan is occupied by the American soldiers also being rebuilt. So we're sending supplies to these people, and we're able to create this pocket to stop the invasion from getting closer to Busan. But they almost succeeded in their objective of taking over the entire peninsula. Of course, the United Nations declared this was an outrage and ordered North Korea to withdraw. But unfortunately, China and the Soviet Union, who were both on the Security Council in the United Nations, did not support any major drastic actions. But the United Nations did approve the United States and other nations to fight a United Nations action against North Korea to liberate South Korea. And what happened was, in a nutshell, instead of reinforcing more and more armies here to fight all the way back, what the American-led United Nations forces did, they launched an amphibious invasion and landed a giant army back here at right out here in Incheon, which is near Seoul, behind the front lines of the communist forces. And then they drove across the peninsula really quickly. And basically what they did is they cut off all the supplies coming from the north to feed and supply them. Every bullet that they fire has to be replaced, right? Every cannon they fire has to have new shells. So when the invading forces cut across the peninsula here and sealed their fate, they basically were left with no reinforcements or no supplies and literally ran home, ran all the way up, and then of course the Americans began pursuing them back north. Now, an interesting tale is when the American forces coming north got to the 38th parallel, President Truman ordered the commanding general, General Douglas MacArthur, to stop, to not go into North Korea. But MacArthur, who was a glory hound, he wanted to be, he loves his name being in the newspapers. He basically told Truman that Truman is not there. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't understand the fluidity of the battle. And he insisted and he kept going into North Korea. And he kept promising everyone, oh, yeah, the war is going to be over by Christmas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as he kept getting closer and farther north, in North Korea, getting closer to China now, Truman is ordering him to stop. And he refused to stop. His goal was to conquer all of North Korea. And unfortunately, since he did not understand the politics of the Cold War, as the American and UN forces approach the Yalu River, the border between China and North Korea is a river called the Yalu River. 1 million Chinese soldiers suddenly, we did not know they were there, poured across the river and attacked the UN forces, forcing the UN forces all the way back down to here. So what you see here are the dates of each of these steps of the war. And this is about as far as they got before the UN forces were able to regroup and then once again go on the offensive. And then for the next 2 years, almost, year and a half, I'd say 2 years, basically we were able to push them out of South Korea, but ultimately this became once again a stalemate between the North and the South, until finally in 1953 there was an agreement to a ceasefire, and this was the line agreed upon to end the Korean conflict. Basically, with that being done, actually there's still a state of war existing. They never signed an armistice. They just have the ceasefire. That is what the nation of Korea looks like today. What separates the two nations is this 2.5 mile wide demilitarized zone that has United Nations troops stationed in there. So, of course, if anyone invades, they have to kill the United Nations soldiers here who represent, 80 different countries of the world. And, of course, that means those 80 countries will declare war on the people who kill their soldiers. So that's what's kept the peace so far up until now. The next time that it gets heated up is a little bit more than a decade later in the early 1960s. It's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959 in Cuba, Fidel Castro actually overthrew their corrupt government and set up a communist regime in Cuba, which is actually his brother is still the dictator right now. And basically, they became the enemies of the United States and the friends of the Soviet Union. This is President Kennedy, and Nikita Khrushchev is the premier of the Soviet Union. And the Cuban Missile Crisis represents this time, 13 days in October, when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing ICBMs, nuclear missiles that could strike the United States without warning. Basically, they could hit Atlanta with 2 minutes. Miami, in matter of seconds, could be nuked. And that basically set off this stand against each other between the United States and Soviet Union. This is the time in history when the world came closest to a nuclear war. Okay? Now, luckily, the two leaders were able to prevail, calmer heads, and finally they were able to reach an agreement instead of going war. But the United States was ready to invade Cuba. And had we done that, we would have been killing the Soviet soldiers who were in Cuba installing those nuclear missiles, and that would have set us off in a war. But in the end, it was stopped. But let me just give you a breakdown of how it happened. Back in the days before satellites, we used to use spy planes. This here is the famous U-2, like the rock group U-2 spy plane that basically flies so high. The concept was that if it flies so high, by the time that it can fly over the enemy territory and they launch an anti-air missile at it, and it's so high that it takes the missile so long to get that altitude that the plane's already gone. But it wasn't foolproof. Several of them were shot down. Actually, one shot down during the 13-day crisis over the Soviet Union. But the cameras are really powerful, and we're able to take pictures in Cuba, and that's where we discovered the missile sites being installed and the missile being ready to be in place. So the president decided, instead of declaring war or attacking, he launched what is called a quarantine. Now, if we blockade Cuba, that's an act of war. So he called it a quarantine, saying that any ships coming to Cuba will have to be stopped and searched by the United States Navy. And anyone that's carrying any kind of nuclear weapons will be forced to turn around and go home. And of course, the Soviet Union cried foul that this is an act of war, and it went to the United Nations. And this is the famous picture when the Soviet Union denied that they weren't doing anything in Cuba, when the United States ambassador pulled out the pictures and then showed everyone in the United Nations exactly what was going on. And that, of course, solidified the support in the world for the United States doing what they did. And like I said, in the end, calmer heads prevailed. The space race represents the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to be the first ones to go to the moon. The reason it began is because way back in 1959, let me go back for a second. In 57, I'm sorry, the Soviets were the first nation to launch a satellite into space. This is Sputnik, about the size of a beach ball. It actually orbited the Earth about 3 times and sent little radio signals back to Earth. But that scared everyone in the world because now the Soviets could be putting nuclear missiles into space. And the basic achievements between the United States and the Soviet Union to be the first one to finally make it to the moon, well, the Soviets had the first satellite. They sent the first dog to space. Her name was Laika. Unfortunately, they did not have the technology to bring her home. So, of course, when the satellite ran out of fuel, it burned up in the atmosphere with the dog with her. The first man in space, the first docking between 2 satellites, the first female, the first 3-man crew, and the first person to actually walk out of the spaceship into space, kind of like what this guy's doing here. Of course, the United States, we set the endurance records. We were first to leave the Earth's orbit. We were first to orbit the moon, and we did win the race by landing on the moon with Neil Armstrong, who was the first human being to touch the moon. Buzz Aldrin was the second human being, and Michael Collins was the command module pilot, so he was the one that remained up orbiting the moon while these two went down. And this is a famous picture called Earthrise that he took. Now imagine this. This is a picture of Earth with everyone from all of human history, past and present, is in this photo. All the dead people, all the living people. Right down here is the landing module with the 2 astronauts. So in this photograph, of all the human beings in history, only Michael Collins does not appear in this photograph. One last example of the Cold War heating up is the war in Vietnam. I'm not going to spend too much on this. This is all, you can copy down the things in red, but the North Vietnamese were created communists after the World War II, where the South Vietnamese were capitalists. They were very corrupt, though. And after, this was a French colony, and after the North Vietnamese defeated the French, basically, that's the Vietnamese were fighting together against the French. The United States sent soldiers in to protect North Vietnam from conquering South Vietnam. It was the longest war in American history until we began the war on terrorism. Altogether, about 58,000 Americans will lose their lives. Some highlights that we need to talk about. We lost the war. This is the famous war that the United States lost because we could not form a policy in the nation in the war because we were afraid of bringing the Soviet Union and Chinese into World War III by them getting involved since we're fighting communism. Also, the people at home were not in favor of this war because South Vietnam was very, very corrupt, and it made it look like we were sending our boys to die for this corruption, these corrupt people to stay in power. And of course, we could not help the South Vietnamese because they were not very well organized either. One thing I do want to talk about is the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive is the famous war attack battle during the holiday called Tet, or the New Year, where they were able to launch a major offensive. Over 100 cities were attacked. Now, we actually came back and destroyed the offensive, doing major damage to the army. But the Tet Offensive convinced the United States that we were involved in a war that not only was it senseless to us, but we weren't going to be able to win. And this is what began the movements at home to withdraw from the war. And basically, we ended up withdrawing from the war in 1973. And of course, after that, North Vietnam conquered South Vietnam, making it a communist peninsula. This is the first war we lost. Further down are pictures of Vietnam, and also at the end are the questions.